tonight, the man of the hour, you would say, we're going to be talking about Goethe. And as many of you attended the last lecture knows, this is sort of an interest of ours because the Goethe myth, certainly in the 18th century, was one of the most fascinating to a lot of people. And although you could argue that Goethe's Faust is the apotheosis of the entire story, it was very much alive. And some people would call our very own century or modernity the Faustian century. And we have Dr. David Kretz, who comes to us from Austria, and he popped into the library one day. He and his lovely partner Danica, and we had all kinds of things to talk about. And about during the first 5 minutes, I was like, you should talk for us. And after many ups and downs and missed dates and random emails, we finally got it worked out. And I'm very, very grateful to have him. He's currently doing a postdoc at Yale University, but he's currently at Yale University doing a postdoc in the humanities. And we are very grateful to have him. So with that, David, if you'd like to go ahead and start sharing your PowerPoint. And again, the warmest of welcome. We hope to see all of you again. Thank you so very much for taking the time.
Well, thank you for the kind introduction, Del, and thank you for having me. Yeah, it was a wonderful serendipitous meeting at that library many months ago. Thanks to Danica, I should say, who really found it for us, and I'm so glad to talk to you about Faust here. So, as mentioned in the introduction, I am an academic. I know you often have academic speakers. I'm also aware this is not per se an academic venue. So, I'll try to find the right mode here. As it says in the play itself, at some point, all theories, dear friend, are gray and golden. The golden tree of life is green. So, what this is going to be, I hope, is a reading of the play to think with the play about religion, about art, questions of magic, and especially about the relationship of Christianity and tragedy. So yeah, I'm hoping to go for about 45 minutes, if that's good, and then I think we can have a Q&A and just have a conversation about the play and what's going on there. And yeah, I'm excited that you've been thinking about the Faust myth for a while, and I'm sure you all have great thoughts about it. So I look forward to the discussion. Maybe I can ask how many of you know the play, let's say, in broadest outline? Little bit. So, okay, good. I mean, I'll recapitulate the plot. I mean, the basic plot is there's a scholar, Faust, who in the very beginning despairs of science, of scholarship, and turns to alchemy and magic, and eventually forms a pact with the devil, or with a devil, Mephistopheles, Mephisto for short. It's never quite clear whether he's the devil or a devil. And he falls in love with a young woman named Gretchen and gets her pregnant. And then while he's off partying, she kills the newborn child and accidentally also her mother, because Faust would not get married, and so there would be no legitimacy to the child, and that would mean social death and total ostracism. And she's sentenced to death, and so Faust's boundless desire for knowledge, natural knowledge, erotic knowledge, leads to death and destruction. That's the in broadest brush strokes the overall outline. All right, so much by way of throat clearing. Let's start. Early on in Goethe's Faust Part 1, we see Faust translate from the Bible. The opening line of the Gospel of John, in the beginning was the Word. There's the Word. I want to start with the question, why is Faust translating from the Bible? Arguably because the Gospel, the Evangelion, literally the good news, frohe Botschaft, has become unintelligible to him. 2 scenes prior, Faust confesses in a moment of existential despair, although I hear the gospel, yet I lack in faith. And he comes close to suicide in that moment, but then church bells ring. It is Easter morning, and this resonates in the deep strata of his soul and pulls him back from the brink of despair and death. And if we read this scene allegorically, if we take Faust, which doubtlessly he is, also as a sort of allegory of modern man, the message would seem to be that the Christian Gospels have lost their vibrancy and translucency for Faust and for the moderns, even as they continue to draw on these religious sources, however dimly understood they are. And the only question seems to be for how long yet. And the rest of the tragedy might seem to suggest that it is already too late, at least for our protagonist, who at the end of part one is quite literally the devil's. But before we rush to conclusions, I want to dwell a bit today with you on the translation scene and note that the play, at least momentarily, holds up a suggestion for us. And the suggestion is that the response to kind of bad secularization would be translation, right? So if the gospel has become unintelligible, unattractive, feels outdated, opaque, one would have to translate it into a new idiom, into a new form, perhaps to make it feel alive again. Perhaps somewhat the way Luther and the Reformers invigorated Christianity by translating the Bible into various vernaculars. What does Faust make of that idea? What does Goethe make of that idea? And what are we to make of it? And I'll mention here only in passing that the idea that translation is the name for a non-destructive mode of secularization, a kind of benign religious transformation, is something that is much discussed actually in certain corners of philosophy today. Critical theory, the German thinker Jürgen Habermas is a sort of anchor of these debates. Talal Assad, Judith Butler, others participate in them. That's a kind of academic side note, and all of this happens without much reference to Goethe. And I just want to mention that there is a sort of afterlife of this idea. There is also an older way of thinking about religion and translation, which I do believe Goethe would have been aware of. And there I'm thinking about the concept of translatio religionis. Translatio had been a conceptual cornerstone of Western historical thought, basically for as long as Latin was the dominant language, intellectual language, from Roman antiquity to, let's say, the 16th century and a bit onwards. And here I'm relying on this magisterial book by a German medievalist called Werner Goetz it's from the 50s, and unfortunately it's not been translated into English, but it's the history of that idea. The basic idea was that history as such consists of a series of translaciones, or translations, transfers, translations of empire, imperium, translatio imperii, which we might translate sort of translation of command or power or the right to rule, and also translatio studi, the idea that knowledge, the sciences, the artes liberales were transferred historically from one nation to another. It's an idea that, as the quote on the slide shows, can be found in certain apocryphal parts of the Bible, but also, for example, in the book of Daniel, in certain permutations or versions of it. What is less well known is that sometimes, besides translatio imperii et studi, there was also this idea of translatio religionis. And primarily, this was a Christian way of referring to how they inherited Judaism. Here's a quote from the 3rd century theologian Origen, who wrote that the Apostle Paul taught in what manner the sum of religion had been translated from the Jews to the Gentiles, from circumcision to faith, letter to spirit, shadow to truth, and so on and so forth. Goethe wrote in the translation. So Faust, he began writing in the 18th century, in the 1770s. But the translation scene comes from the end of the 18th century, 1790s. It's not yet in the earliest drafts. And so this means that this is from a moment when the French Revolution had shaken the Ancien Regime and its theological political foundations, right? Not just the killing of a king, but the abandoning of kingship. And there were fears about the political fallout from rapid secularization in the air, certainly among the somewhat more conservative observers of the political scene that Goethe was one of. Unlike Kant or Schiller, let's say, he was much more skeptical of the revolution. but this was a discourse that people were afraid that this enlightenment, rationalism, and secularization had led to the terror, basically. Um, and so in this context, Goethe asks, what may save modern man, Faust, allegorically, when all the forms of religion are lost, and people turn to dark forms of magic and technology. Um, Immanuel Kant, in his book on religion, written at during the peak of Jacobin terror, proposed a certain schema that calls to mind perhaps Joachim of Fiore or Lessing, closer to Goethe and Kant, that there are three ages of the world. There's the first age, Judaism, the Old Testament. There's Christianity, the New Testament, and that would be succeeded by, in Kant's telling, rational religion. But there was also an alternative story that we associate with the Romantics and perhaps philosophers like Schelling. There's a photograph of him here. Schelling was, I think, the first great philosopher of whom we have a photograph. He died in the 1850s, so just in time to witness that new technology. And here the idea is that what's there to succeed Christians or religion in its orthodox traditional form is not a form of enlightenment rationalism, but art. And I think Goethe, sort of the reading I want to give, partakes in that paradigm in a certain way, but in an original way. And what's unique to Goethe's Faust, I think, is the idea that the transition to the next phase would have to be a form of translation. So what would a translation look like that restored the spirit to the letter? That's the question here. So let's look at Faust's translation a bit more closely. I am, among other things, a scholar of translation history around 1800, and I work with translators' prefaces. I have a corpus of 330 translators' prefaces from 1750 to 1830. That is what in German studies we call the Age of Goethe, because it very exactly overlaps with Goethe's lifetime. And reading through this corpus, it gives you a sense of how people at the time actually thought about translation and what it meant to them, what values they aspire to. And if we hold this corpus against the translation scene from Faust, it will appear to us in a new light. So here's the scene. This is Faust speaking. I feel impelled to open a text on which all rests, and deeply moved, properly translate the sacred Greek original into my own dear native tongue. It is written, in the beginning was the Word. How soon I'm stopped. Who'll help me to go on? I cannot concede that words have such high worth, and must, if properly inspired, translate the term some other way. It is written, in the beginning was the sense. Reflect with care upon this first line, and do not let your pen be hasty. Can it be sense that makes all operate? I'd better write, in the beginning was the force. Yet even as I write this down, something warns me not to keep it. The spirit prompts me, now I see a solution, and boldly write, in the beginning was the act. Tat. All right, famous scene. So Faust proposes to translate first as or considers word, which is of course how Luther renders that line. So here, Goethe is just giving you Luther's translation of the opening of the Gospel of John, and then sense or meaning, Sinn, and then force, power, Kraft, and finally the deed, the act, Tat. When we hold the translation scene against the corpus, we see that the first three options Faust considers, Wort, Sinn, and Kraft, metonymically stand for translation maxims that were known since antiquity. The first, fidelity as literality, Wörtlichkeit, to translate word for word, which Horace already warned poets against, but recommended for translators. And then prominent alternatives, the idea that we should not translate non-verbum e verbum, not word for word, but to express meaning for meaning, or sensum. And finally, there's the idea that Cicero, for example, mentions at one point that one should try to preserve the kind and force, vis, the poetic force here, the poetic Kraft of each word. And what's more, all of these three translation principles or translation maxims, they were not just ancient theory, but all of these were live options in the translation discourse around 1800. So just so you know that I'm not making this up, I brought you a few examples here. Fittingly, they all come from Cicero translations. Here's a philologian, Friedrich Karl Wolff, translating a rhetorical treatise by Cicero, and he writes, I strove to translate faithfully, that is, the words themselves according to their order and connection. And so this approach is really typical of academic philological translations, particularly in this insistence on preserving even the original syntax as far as possible. Case for the second maxim would be the philosopher Christian Garve, who translates an ethical treatise by Cicero. And he says, I've made it my intention not to portray the spirit of Cicero, but to present his ideas. I did not want to offer a painting, but teach useful truths, right? So the ideas need to get across. You need to preserve the sense, the meaning, not so much the form or the exact words or order. And then finally, here's a poet, Christoph Martin Wieland, who was a poet, a novelist, and an avid translator, and he translated Cicero's letters. And he cares very much about the portrait these offer of Cicero's persona in his time, and about the poetic force of Cicero's style, right? So he's writing about the powerful expression, the kräftiger Ausdruck. You have Kraft in the adjective here, that he wants to preserve. Now, these three options can seem like very strong differences, but really, I think they are complementary styles of translation. The particular choices here are explained in part because of by the translator's backgrounds and the text they choose, right? We have the philologian Wolff with a treatise on rhetoric, the philosopher Garve with a book on ethics, and then Wieland cares about the poet translates the letters, where there's arguably more reason to care about the particular idiosyncratic tone and formulations of Cicero. And already in 1767, Johann Gottfried Herder, a philosopher who was actually one of Goethe's mentors, saw the need for a synthesis, and he said, where is the translator who would be philosopher, poet, and philologian at once? He should be the morning star of a new epoch in our literature. So in short, what I want to suggest is that the translation discourse as a time was capacious enough to acknowledge that ideally one would be able to synthesize and balance these maxims as far as possible. And where that is not possible, one would try to prioritize depending on the author and even the particular text that one is translating. But what also becomes clear from this brief exercise in contextualizing is that Faust's fourth option falls entirely outside the translation discourse of the time, and perhaps even outside of any concept of translation. Faust translates as action and takes action. Action and translation coincide. In keeping with reading the passage as commentary on various approaches to translation as such, the final option, in my view, illustrates a translation that knows of no fidelity but to its own deed. Translation crosses over into pure poetic creation here. Faust claims for his translation to be inspired. It is unlikely, though, I think, that Faust is here invoking the Holy Spirit, which on the day of Pentecost bestowed the gift of language onto the apostles. As seen earlier, he had used magic to summon the earth spirit, and in this scene too, he's surrounded by unidentified spirits, and watching over it all in the disguise of a poodle is Mephistopheles, a devil who will soon reveal himself and forge the famous Faustian pact with our protagonist. The turn towards the spirit here, or spirits, means also a progressive distancing from the letter of the text on which all rests, the Grundtext. It is not clear whether Faust even looks at what he calls the Holy Original in its original Greek. All right, he opens a volume and says, "It is written in the beginning was the Word," but of course this is written in Luther's German and not in John's Greek. And repeats, "It is written alongside the first suggestion. In the beginning was the meaning, Sinn." And so if you were to adopt this for the stage, we'd have to decide, is he looking at what is written in the original before him, or is he looking at what he just wrote on a piece of paper as his first attempt? The text itself admits both readings, and the ambiguity persists then in the next alternative. It ought to say in the beginning was force, the force. it might be that Faust is sort of talking to himself about what he now ought to write, or it might be that he's telling the evangelist in absentia, or perhaps Luther, what they should have written. And then with the final suggestion, there are really no more worries about the original at all. Suddenly I see a solution and boldly write, schreib getrost. It's this moment of really maximal resolve and self-certainty. Schreib getrost and boldly write. Conveys in a German a strong sense of insouciance, of a certain like careless, here I go. Any doubts about the original meaning, its difficulties and demands are left far behind. The letter is sacrificed, but not, I would argue, to the spirit that gives life. Faust's approach to translation bespeaks an attitude, moreover, that in the play directly leads to tragedy. So here we return to our concerns about religion at large, and I now want to say how what we've just learned about Faust the translator sheds interesting light on Faust's relation to the other two main characters in the play. On the one hand, Gretchen, his love interest, and on the other hand, onto the famous pact or wager, we should actually say, with Mephisto. Let's start with Gretchen and step back for a moment. What is being translated here? The word. The word, of course, the Johannine logos, the word that became flesh. But words are a topic in this play throughout. Words are supposed to have meaning, vibrancy, intelligibility, and the play repeatedly stages a kind of skepticism about that. So early on, and there's a kind of a prelude to the whole play where we see the theater director and the playwright and the comedian sort of on the stage talking to each other. We have to put on the play now. How should we do it? Well, we need the good special effects and we need a bit of tragedy and wait, yes, but also comedy, and go back and forth. And eventually the director says, all right, enough talking. We've exchanged plenty of words. Now let me see some deeds. And then when the play actually opens in first Faust monologues, he says, I want to be done with peddling empty words. He has enough of it's just words, words, words. And somewhat ironically, when he makes the pact with Mephisto, Mephisto wants a signature. He wants him to write his name in blood. And Faust initially complains, is it not enough? Hang on a second. That's a different one. Here, that's the final one. Have you not ever known a man whose word was good? Is it not enough that my spoken word grants perpetual title? But I gave you two more instances just before about word skepticism. The third one here is when he talks to a student and his assistant Wagner, and he says, like he really wants to learn rhetoric, and Faust says, rhetoric is just words, like you gotta mean it, you gotta have it in your heart. And the fourth line we have just seen in the translation scene, of course, the critique of the first option. I cannot concede that words have such high worth, and Mephisto will pick up on that when Faust proposes that his word should be enough. So this is already, just sort of leading up to the wager and the translation scene. So many instances where the play puts this question before the readers, like what do words still mean? And what does the word mean? So there's a question here about Christianity, but also a question about the meaning of words and forms and cultural and religious forms more generally. There's a crisis of meaning that this play engages here. Do words still mean something in every sense of the word? And this is also a crisis of social relations, of promises, of contracts, of trust between student and teacher, and of course between men and women. And the one key social relation here that the play is concerned with is marriage. And the key scene for that comes 2/3 into the play when Gretchen asks a famous question. It's known as Gretchen's question, the Gretchenfrage, which in German has become a kind of idiomatic way of saying the question on which everything hinges. In the scene, we see Gretchen and Faust sitting in the garden, and before Gretchen agrees to sleep with Faust, there's just one more thing she needs to know. And she says, Heinrich, promise me as best I can. And the implication is, of course, promise me you don't dump me after I sleep with you and leave me in this situation. But then she's shy and so says, well, so tell me, so religion, what does that mean to you? And she expands a little bit on her question because what she really wants to know is, of course, the promise, the sacrament. And then she talks about the sacrament of Mass and confession. Gretchen is a Catholic, we know. So she doesn't mention marriage, but she sort of dances around that. It's the subtext here, the elephant in the room, if you will. And she asks, so do you believe in God? Maybe he's not a Catholic, maybe he doesn't believe in the Holy Sacrament of marriage or whatnot. But at least if he believes in God, then you can trust he's a decent fella. He would do the right thing, right? Um, and Faust's answer is a kind of verbose, evasive spiritualism, and there we get more language skepticism. So Faust says, well, God, what's God really anyway? I mean, sort of nature and love and feeling and the heart, and it's a bit of this and a bit of that, and people have many names, and like, don't you know I love you? um what's interesting here for us is that twice in that scene, Gretchen will address Faust by his name, Heinrich. You have it there in the first line on the slide. um and this anticipates the very final line of the play. We're gonna get to it when she twice calls out his name, or Heinrich, as the curtain falls. And if in this earlier scene you take the two lines where she uses his first name, here I gave you the one, and then 80 lines later there's another one, and you take that stretch of text and you cut it in the exact numerical middle, this line in yellow here is what you find. So there is Faust. Happiness, heart, love, God. I have no name to give it. Feeling is everything. Name is but sound and smoke. Right. So there's again this sort of language skepticism. What's in a name? Um, Faust thinks he's full of the spirit. He thinks he's inspired just as a translator, but he does not have the name. He does not have the word, the letter of it. And Gretchen, the supposedly naive girl, sees through Faust's verbiage quite clearly and points out with cutting perspective, you've got no Christianity. Du hast kein Christentum. No Christianity, not the name, not the letter of it, not its law and ritual, and not the sacrament of marriage. And of course, that matters to Gretchen because, I mean, in this society, if children out of wedlock, especially for lower class girls like Gretchen, that is a problem. That means social ostracism. That means crushing poverty. It's it's a real issue. Okay. The question of marriage connects also, and here we get to the second key character besides Gretchen, that Faust relates to Mephisto, and the pact that Faust and Mephisto have, or the wager. Let's get that into view. Faust, as I mentioned, is depressed in the beginning, and he does not really care about the afterlife. That's not who he is. He does not really believe in it. So here's Gretchen's. You've got no Christianity. This is Faust as he's talking to Mephisto. With the beyond, I cannot be much bothered. Once you annihilate this world, the other can have its turn existing. The earth's the source of all my joys, and this sun shines upon my sorrows. And what's interesting is that, in a way, this is actually the same for Mephisto. He says to the Lord God in another prologue, "You have my thanks." As when the Lord says, go and try and corrupt Faust. Mephisto says, "Thanks, you have my thanks. As for the dead, I never did much care to bother with them. I, like the cat, prefer my mouse alive." Okay, so first of all, what we should take away from this is that in Goethe's play, the whole wager is framed imminently. Yeah, it's not so much about whether Faust then in the afterlife will burn in hell. The question is about this life. Is this life here now worth living? Faust has despaired of it, and he's challenging Mephisto. If you can present me with something that I will never despair of, or never get bored with, an infinity within this finite world, a moment, an Augenblick that carries, as it were, eternity within it, then I've had my eternity in this life and can die happy. And for all I care in the beyond, I can be yours. Affirming the Augenblick as eternity, as infinity in the finite. Goethe's Faust is an ancestor to Nietzsche's Zarathustra, and this idea of the eternal return as an existential test. Sort of, if this moment in life were to repeat infinitely, would you still affirm it? Would you still say yes to it? I brought you here. Let me read you out the famous eternal return quote from Nietzsche. What if some day or night a demon were to steal after you into your loneliest loneliness and say to you, this life as you now live it and have lived it, you will have to live once more and innumerable times more. And there will be nothing new in it, but every pain and every joy and every thought and sigh and everything unutterably small or great in your life will have to return to you all in the same succession and sequence. Right? It's this idea of repetition. Would you not throw yourself down and gnash your teeth and curse the demon who spoke thus? Or have you once experienced a tremendous moment, right? There's the Augenblick again, the moment, when you would have answered him, you are a god, and never have I heard anything more divine. So this is this kind of Nietzschean heroic moment of saying yes to the world, even in all of it, and even if it were infinitely to repeat. But of course, the closest many, perhaps most of us, will get to such an affirmation in life, and the somewhat more prosaic version of this is marriage, a wedding vow. Yes, I do. Faust is faithless as a translator, and his faithlessness as a lover and his lack of Christian faith, I want to suggest, in Goethe's play are thus sort of all of one piece. Faust knows not the name and not the letter of this religion, no marriage, no legitimacy to the child, and hence the tragic ending of the play. She kills the child, Gretchen, and in the process she accidentally also kills the mother. She just wanted to give her some sleeping pills so she doesn't notice, but Mephisto might have manipulated that. It's sort of left a little ambiguous, and the mother dies also, and Gretchen is sentenced to death as a double murderer. This is a expressionist woodcut of her. As a background, this was a common social problem at the time, that girls of lower classes would be taken advantage of, often by men of higher classes, who promised them heaven and then left them sitting. And because of all the consequences to out of wedlock children that I mentioned, there was a somewhat high rate also of infanticides, which in this society, of course, was seen as doubly horrendous because, for obvious reasons, these babies were not baptized, and that meant you didn't just kill them; you sent them straight to hellfire. Also, there are two historical cases that are said to have inspired Goethe here. The one is by Susanne Margareta Brandt, who was a sort of real life Gretchen in 1772 that inspired the early cases. But then there was also another case of Johanna Christina Höhn, and this was in 1783. And then Goethe had already written the whole Gretchen plot. And public opinion around the time sort of swayed a little bit, and there was a sense that the law was not quite up to date, that this was a bit harsh, or too harsh, these punishments on these women, that they do not deserve the death penalty. And in fact, what we know in the case of Johanna Christina Höhn was that the Duke was inclined to commit the sentence. However, and at this point, Goethe was a member of the court, having already written the Gretchen plot, and it seems from the archival evidence that Goethe supported the death sentence in this case. This came out in, I think, in the 1930s, and shocked people, because Faust had always been read as the sort of social criticism in that regard. And the idea that Goethe, who was seen as sort of intervening with the play in this sort of social cause, could still sign off as one member of a court on the death sentence to a woman, was puzzling to people. I'll get back to this issue a little bit at the end and try to say a few more words about it. Okay. Faust translation within the play is a failure, a dead end, quite literally. But the question can be asked whether Goethe's play is a successful translation of tragic form in the medium of dramatic poetry, and through it also of Christian grace. And I want to argue that the answer is yes, and it is both precisely because and insofar as it is either. The letter of tragic form is sacrificed to retain its spirit, the ethical content of tragedy. The letter of tragedy would be all kinds of genre conventions that go back to Aristotle. The spirit of tragedy would be its capacity to make suffering meaningful, sublime even, to give it a kind of dignity. When we read Faust as the tragedy of Gretchen, we can read it as deploying tragedy to mourn Christian forms, Gretchen being an allegory of the Christian Middle Ages, of Christianity, just as Faust is sort of the allegory of modern man, mourning these forms while preparing their resurrection in art, specifically allowing art to enable grace, allowing art to have an atoning, salvific function. The letter and the spirit. These are Christian theological Pauline terms. They are also the core terms of translation theory. Translation, I submit, is the art of sacrificing. If you study translational discourse around 1800, as I do, you'll notice that these translators, quite reasonably, I think, saw trade-offs as inevitable. In translation, fidelity simply means to do this well, to be faithful to that which one discerns to matter most in a text, and then to make the trade-offs accordingly. And these translators used the metaphors of letter and spirit to capture this idea, even as the particular aspect of the original to which letter and spirit refer vary from instance to instance. So a translator might think of the spirit to which the literal letter is sacrificed as the meaning. Another might think of it as the poetic force, as the spirit, and that the meaning is the letter which we sacrifice to retain the poetic force, right? So letter and spirit in this construal are logical rather than substantive positions. The letter simply is that which is sacrificed, and the spirit that for the sake of which the letter is sacrificed, right? There's a versatility to that. However, and this is really crucial, translation begins from an initial commitment to the whole of the original. The idea is that first of all, we have to understand letter and spirit in their unity. We have to understand the whole of that which we're translating. So the letter is not simply discarded or thrown away. It's sacrificed, and that means that its value is affirmed. The trade-off is necessary, tragically, if you will. But the sacrifice of the letter makes it possible, and that gives a value to the letter too, and in a way is a way of mourning the letter. And I want to suggest that Goethe's play operates such a mourning, sacrificial translation of tragedy at the level of form. The title declares it to be a tragedy. Faust, a tragedy, is the full title of the play. Goethe never wrote another one. This is Goethe's only tragedy. He was not a friend of the form generally. And it is not a tragedy in the traditional Aristotelian sense. So instead of, say, the unity of space and time, we get a marked sense of temporal acceleration as the play proceeds, dizzying, disorienting moves across space and time. Tragedy also competes with comedy. Comedy is sort of embodied by Mephisto, who constantly makes jokes, and it was Schelling, who we've seen on that photograph earlier, who remarked in an early commentary that tragedy and comedy are almost distinct in that play. There are moments when you almost cannot tell which it is, except for the last scene when there are no more jokes. But tragedy has sort of lost its formal sovereignty. There are lyric songs inserted throughout the play everywhere. Gretchen especially is a character who's associated with the lyric form. And yet, the ethical core of tragedy, I want to suggest, is preserved. Namely, how there can be dignity in suffering through a kind of sublime and heroic affirmation. So in this reading, it is not so much Faust who's our tragic hero here, but Gretchen. At the end of the play, Faust wants her to escape from prison. He sneaks into prison and proposes a life on the run. And that would break tragic form, a happy end, without sublimity, without tragic resignation, and without justice in a way. After all, she did kill child and mother. But Gretchen makes a different choice. She admits her guilt, submits to her fate, accepts it with a kind of tragic greatness. She becomes an agent here in the emphatic sense, not in the Promethean Faustian sense, but through sublime, tragic, heroic acceptance. And therefore, she is saved. Here are the final lines of the play. Mephisto wants Faust to leave her and says, "Go, let's run. She is judged." Voice from above. She is saved. Ist gerettet. Faust at the end of part one is the devil's here. Away with me. He's with Mephisto. He's with the devil. The devil pulls him off stage. Gretchen, we are told, is saved. But saved how? By whom? There are three instances that need to come together here. First of all, there's the author, Goethe, who cuts short the action. If the story were to continue, Gretchen would die either on stage or off stage. The cut in the drama, in the action here, does neither show nor hide her death. Instead, the action is sort of infinitely suspended in time. Art can arrest time, that is a romantic topos, of course. Painting and lyric poetry do it particularly well. It is an Orphic conceit that our mortal bodies die, but from mourning can spring song infinitely. Drama cannot do this quite as well, because per definition, drama is a representation of action, and action necessarily unfolds in time. So to permanently arrest time in drama, the action needs to be cut off here, and Goethe does this. Secondly, there is the voice from above. Ancient tragedy, particularly Euripides, interestingly, knew of the Deus ex machina moment, but no god makes an appearance here. This voice is sounding out just as the curtain falls. It's a nameless, disembodied voice that's sort of neither fully in the play nor fully outside of the play. It speaks precisely at the edge of the diegetic space, undecidably inside or outside, sort of spatially. It's kind of above the stage, on sort of within. Temporarily, it's in those final sections when the curtain has begun to fall and has not yet quite fully fallen. In the earliest versions of the play from the 70s, the line is still missing. And without it, the ending reads much more grimly, brutally, nihilistically even. Faust is the devil's, and Gretchen is bound for hell after her impending death. And, in that case, we might think of the falling curtain as a sort of a figuration almost of the blade that would soon sever Gretchen's head off her body, but not so in the final version. She is saved, and the falling curtain cuts short the drama and is sort of transfigured into a gesture of grace. And finally, besides the sovereign author and the mediating voice, there is the audience, the community of witnesses who hear the verdict and to whom it is submitted, as it were, for ratification. If art inherits theology here, it is tempting to think about author, voice, and audience as inheriting distinct soteriological functions in some sort of Trinitarian schema. The author as the father, maybe the voice of mediating between stage and audience space as the son, and then the audience as the community, the spirit, perhaps. That is a little bit speculative. I don't want to insist on these parallels too strictly, but I think what matters is that grace is operated cooperatively here and aesthetically between author, quasi-diegetic voice, and the audience. So in this way, the doctrinal, theological ladder of grace too is sacrificed, but its spirit lives on. Gretchen is saved, but not on the level of plot. Her death is infinitely suspended, but it is not undone. The play ends tragically. Her salvation is instead aesthetic. And I want to say that, almost at the end here, from this point of view, I think we might wonder, and I would love to hear people's thoughts on this, whether Goethe signing on to the death sentence did not, in a way to him, perhaps disquietingly, appear quite consistent with the idea, certain Christian idea, that sin and crimes have to be paid for in this life by dying like Christ and in Christ and with Christ. Here's a quote by Goethe that perhaps suggests as much. Here we got the falling curtain. I think that illustrates the sort of double reading of the curtain quite well. Here we have the voice again. This is the quote I wanted to show you from a conversation Goethe had reportedly in 1809. Me, a pagan. He's often been accused of being a kind of pagan. After I had Gretchen executed and Ottilia starved to death, is that not Christian enough for people? What could they want that's more Christian? There are many cases where Goethe speaks quite harshly of Christianity, and I mean, there's a certain irony here too, right? He distances himself from it. It's a sort of sarcastic remark. But Faust is not a typical Goethe play, even though I think it is his greatest play. And for all his identification with Faust, I think the greatness of it partly comes from the fact that that Goethe wrote a kind of self-indictment here, or like was able to tell a tragedy of a character he perhaps identifies with. Um, all right, so salvation happens in another world. To be sure, this is an immanent transcendence. It's the world of art, and the world of art is visible in this world, but it is within this our world, another world, and therefore an otherworldly salvation still. Um, and to end, I want to just look at the final line here. Faust's name, again, twice, the singularity of the name repeated. Those lines are Gretchen's, of course, but in a way they are already not hers anymore. She's identified just as a voice from within, fading. So the curtain has now fallen, hence the lines can be within or behind. Strictly speaking, I want to suggest these are not part of the drama anymore. There's no action represented here. We revert rather to lyric form, the lyric poem's disembodied voice. It's close to the Orphic idea again, to repeat the singular mortal existence marked by the name Heinrich in art. But notice the gendered reversal here. Gretchen is our mourning Orphic lyricist, and Faust is called out to, mourned, the object towards which her care reaches. She does not save him, not here, not yet. Part two is a different story, but she has been transfigured into an intercessor. And with that, the play ends, and I end my talk. Thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to your questions.
Okay, that was an absolutely wonderful talk. Um, and I think in many ways it reflects the way that we consider both tragedy and comedy. And there is this point in which Swedenborg is going through the possibilities of the emotions, and he makes this statement that tragedy is often an inversion of comedy, or as it appears, meaning simply that the difference between tragedy and comedy is simply where you're standing at the time. And we know that Goethe had read at the very least The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, and he sends several documents where he talks about this, and he also talks about that he was reading Swedenborg in the 1840s. So this notion that the same sword cuts both to remove badness, but also to cut the heads off people. That's a bad analogy, but that's where I was going. That's what this day has given me. And yeah, there's something very profoundly true about that. And for a while there was this impetus in German scholarship to try to save Goethe, or to raise him up as some kind of hero of the soul. And that caused a lot of damage in terms of his actual historical record, where in many cases he did have positions that were very much in line with his time, and he may not have been the great social revolutionary or romantic revolutionary that people have wanted him to be later on. So again, thank you to a story that goes right to the heart of I would say, human civilization.